From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The House debt ceiling deal heads to the floor as West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin celebrates a provision in it to expedite the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. This deal to raise the debt limit between President Biden and Speaker Kevin McCarthy has several provisions we went through in detail on yesterday's podcast, but one we did not mention involves the Mountain Valley Pipeline that has been stuck in regulatory review. Here's Joe Manchin on Twitter. He says, "I am pleased Speaker McCarthy and his leadership team see the tremendous value in completing the MVP to increase domestic energy production and drive down costs across America, and especially in West Virginia." And here he is Tuesday on Talkline in West Virginia with some additional thoughts.
There's not been a pipeline that has ever been suggested or possibly built in America has ever gone through the scrutiny that the MVP has. None of them have gone through that many times in reviews. 9 times before the courts, the Fourth Circuit, and the same 3 judges every time send something back. They find something that they don't like or not agreeing with and keep sending it back. It's been through the review process. The EIS, which is the Environmental Impact Study, is very, very arduous and a long study. It's been through that 3 times. Never before has ever happened. So there's nothing been basically reviewed as thoroughly as the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And what they're not telling you also is when they're telling you that we're skipping different procedures, we're not skipping any of them. It's just time to move on.
Alicia, you have followed the travails of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Can you remind us again, what are the basics of this project? What is it being set up to do? And how long has it been stuck in this legal limbo?
So this is a 303-mile pipeline that would aim to deliver more natural gas from Appalachia, namely West Virginia, which actually is experiencing a fracking boom, to the southeast, which really doesn't have a ready gas supply. Most of the gas that it currently gets is actually from the Permian and Oklahoma and those areas. So this would actually increase the gas supply heading toward the southeast and potentially be able to, build more natural gas plants to replace coal, or heaven forbid, allow homeowners to rely on natural gas for heating rather than electricity, which is actually the most common way of heating in the South is electricity, which is actually less efficient. This project was initially proposed in 2014 and been stuck. It is now about 95% of the way complete. Most of the construction has actually been completed on the project. There's actually the bit that hasn't been completed is mostly environmental restoration, which is the big irony of it all, is that you've had these green groups for the last several years file lawsuit after lawsuit challenging the permits granted by the federal agencies, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as well as the U.S. Forest Service. And these also include, by the way, the biological opinions regarding endangered species. And this Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals panel that Manchin just alluded to keeps on striking them down for one reason or another. It's basically been fly-specking these reviews, finding one problem. Oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. Go back to the drawing board, and the federal regulators have redone their analysis reviews to try to comply with the Fourth Circuit's quibbles. And then the Fourth Circuit finds something else wrong with it. So this is literally like Sisyphean, task. So it has now been 4 years. It's been delayed. So it's 4 years past the construction completion date. And now the cost has doubled. And part of that is just because of the delays and the inflation in building costs, which have been tagged on. So it's now, nearly $7 billion where it was initially proposed only at $3.3 billion. And of course, those costs are probably going to end up being passed on to the customers. Some of the investors in the project will probably also have to eat them. But this is all completely gratuitous. This was a pipeline 4 or 5 years ago. If it had been completed on schedule, there actually would probably be lower greenhouse gas emissions because we'd have more gas, and gas would have replaced coal.
And to repeat the number that Alicia said, this pipeline is about 94% complete. And so that is what's so maddening about some of these environmental and regulatory problems that America is facing, because occasionally the conversation gets started about the Hoover Dam or something like that, something grandiose. Why can't America build things like that anymore? But really, it's even worse than that because we can't even finish the 5% of the pipeline that is needed to be done to turn the gas on after all the investment has been made, a lot of the construction work has been done. And so, Alicia, one thing that I think is important to note here is the context. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin voted for President Biden's so-called Inflation Reduction Act in return for a promise to get some kind of permitting reform. And that didn't happen. He couldn't get that across the line last year. And so that may be part of the argument for his potential challenger, Republican candidate running in 2024 for that Senate seat, Governor Jim Justice. And now Joe Manchin is saying that he has helped push this forward and get the Mountain Valley Pipeline done. But how specifically does the debt limit deal with this issue? What is in the bill that will solve this problem?
So it would require the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to provide any outstanding permits, and those include the ones that the courts have sent back to it. And it would also exempt, and this is really the key provision in the bill, would exempt all permits, including state ones that are issued under the Clean Water Act, from judicial review. Therefore, the Fourth Circuit has no ability to block the project. Any legal challenge would actually have to be a substance of this section of the bill, either a constitutional challenge or saying that the Congress can't basically provide a rubber stamp for this project, which is what it is. I don't think you can get a cleaner way of approving a project than to just summarily exempt it from judicial review and demand or require federal agencies to provide the permits. I wish all gas pipelines would benefit from similar provisions and would get the same kind of deal. To your point, I think this is a terrific, victory for Manchin. And then the irony, though, is that the Republicans ended up rescuing him and delivering it to him, despite the fact that he arguably double-crossed them on the Inflation Reduction Act.
But to the point about improving the environment for any kind of projects, other pipelines, roads, what have you, Kim, what I hope is that this victory for Manchin, this feather in his cap, if he decides to run for re-election in 2024, saying I helped complete the Mountain Valley Pipeline would be big to his state's voters. I'm not sure if it would be big enough to carry him to re-election in a state that is pretty red and pretty Trumpy. But I hope that doesn't take the wind out of the sails of the motivation in Congress and for Joe Manchin to push for broader permitting reform. There are some provisions, as we discussed yesterday, in this debt limit deal that would encode some changes into the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and give project managers a right to sue if these environmental reviews are not done on deadline. But there are other ways and maybe better ways, to enforce those kinds of shot clocks. There's a bill recently introduced by West Virginia's other senator, Shelley Moore Capito. And the approach that this bill takes is called the Restart Act. It says that agencies would have 2 years to do an environmental impact statement. And if they don't hit that deadline, then the environmental review is deemed fulfilled. And so the project could move forward. And that's the kind of enforcement mechanism that I think would have a real effect. Those agencies would make sure they hit those targets, because if they didn't, then their review of the project would pretty much end up waived. And maybe that's not the only approach. Maybe that's not an approach that could get 60 votes in the Senate. But this permitting reform conversation is a really big one and a really broad one. And what I'm hoping here is that giving Manchin the Mountain Valley Pipeline doesn't end the chances of anything broader on permitting making it through this Congress.
Far from taking the wind out of the sails, I think the better way to look at the decision by the Republicans to ensure that MVP was in this deal is to, in fact, inflate the sails for further permitting reform in the Senate. When Shelley Moore Capito and John Barrasso, who was the other co-sponsor, introduced that bill, they made it very clear that they didn't necessarily want these provisions that they were putting forward to be part of the debt ceiling discussion, that they felt as though there was a real opportunity and a hunger for Republicans and Democrats to do some real horse trading in the Senate and get a very sweeping change to permitting rules. Because everyone understood that as good as these provisions are that McCarthy bartered as part of this debt ceiling deal, that he was never going to get the White House to go along with the stuff that really, really needs to get done. So think of it this way. You give Joe Manchin something he really, really wants, and then maybe he begins to work with you on your bill. Manchin, don't forget, did introduce his own permitting bill last year. It never went anywhere. That was arguably for the good because it had a lot of flaws in it. One of it is essentially just handed over control to FERC, the authority to plow up a whole bunch of new transmission lines for renewable energy, which is something that Republicans are not necessarily entirely averse to, but there ought to be some significant changes in return. His bill just didn't go far enough. So I think the goal is help Manchin out on one of his top priorities and then get him to negotiate with Republicans on their permitting approach. In addition to the things you talked about in that act, Kyle, the Restart Act, they do have obviously the deadlines and some teeth to failure to comply, but they would put that into the National Environmental Policy Act, so it would be statute. It has some language that's going to tighten up the whole fight over waters of the United States, which is what counts as waters that the United States federal government has control over. They deal with this question of how you count the social cost of carbon when you are putting together rules. And there's another act that they introduced with it, which deals with some other really huge problems, like, for instance, targets for oil and gas leasing by the federal government and liquid natural gas exports, among other things. So that's the goal here, because there's also some other people up for re-election next year in the Senate. John Tester in Montana, Kirsten Sinema in Arizona, who often goes her own way, and other Democrats who care about green projects, who understand that they're being held up in the very same way that fossil fuel projects are. So I still think it's a little unknown, but if people really were in a deal-making mood, this sets the stage for something bigger.